This year, I wanted to do something a bit different in bringing also other diaspora Jewish leaders to this conference, because I think that learning from one another and sharing with one another is a really effective way of doing this work. And then as all these flights started getting canceled, I realized that this was an amazing plan, because I didn't have to worry about how you guys would get in. And so I'm really excited to have this conversation, one, because we still get to have it in person, but two, because this is a really, I think, unique opportunity. I am so grateful and honored to be sitting on a stage between these two people that I admire so much, and whose work I admire, and whose work we've really, in many ways, modeled the work of JSpaceCanada after. And so what we're going to do with this is, I do want this to be a little bit more conversational. We do have myself here in Canada, and Hadar in the US, and Hannah in the UK. And I think that this is kind of an opportunity for us to chat kind of as colleagues and friends, and to let folks in on the conversations that we have. This conversation is going to be, I think, a little bit more high level about our respective communities and organizing our respective communities, but Hadar and Hannah will be speaking in a breakout after this, moderated by John Allen, and we'll get into a little bit more of their specific tactics and strategies that they've used that we can learn from. So really great opportunity for learning from us. You know who I am from my introductory remarks. Before we start chatting, I'm going to ask these two to introduce themselves. And I do just want to say, people keep saying to me, because I'm based in Vancouver, that I brought the rain with me. But it's Hannah's fault, because she's from the UK. So with that, while I've gotten everyone to turn against you, make your pitch to bring them back on board.
Thank you. It's really nice to be here, so thank you for inviting me and having me. And I have to say, the pouring rain makes me feel very at home, especially after a day of glorious sun. It's exactly how I live in London. I'm Hannah Weisfeld. I'm the Executive Director of Yachad, and I guess the shorthand way of explaining what Yachad is and what we do is that we are the JSpace, JStreet equivalent in the UK, and Yachad was founded in 2011, and I am its founding executive director, and I'm still here. And I guess just one of the things that's really, I guess, inspiring about the work we do is the very long-standing relationships and networks that we develop. And, Hadar, Lior, Mickey are all people that I have worked with for a long time. Ben from NIF I've known for over a decade. And Maytal I've got to know in the last few years. And I think that it very much feels that we are in this together, doing this work together. And I feel that when I look at this audience, that I feel very at home in a sea of faces that seem very familiar, and I don't know any of you, but I feel like I could be in London speaking to a similar audience, so it's nice to be here.
Hello, everybody. I'm Hadar Susskind. I'm the president and CEO of New Jewish Narrative. If you are not familiar with New Jewish Narrative, that's because it's new. About, 16 months ago, we merged what was Americans for Peace Now together what was Amenu in the United States, and we came together, and as part of that process, we came out with a new name, so New Jewish Narrative. And I will just say very quickly, on behalf of the relatively sane community of the United States, we apologize. I feel like we're the bad neighbors, like we stopped mowing our lawn and there's a rusty car in our driveway, so sorry.
Apology accepted. So let me start off with kind of bouncing off of what we heard in the first session, and then we can just let the conversation, I think, kind of roll from there. But we'll start us off with a specific question, which is, we are all doing the work that we're doing in our respective communities because we, in whatever way and for whatever reasons, feel very connected to Israel. And feel very connected to the people of Israel, and that's why this is important to us. But we're seeing more and more of a divide. We're seeing more and more that in the diaspora, especially amongst younger generations, Jews moving further away from Israel. And then in Israel, we see Israelis, which is we were kind of talking about in the first panel, we see the shift in Israeli society in the exact opposite direction, becoming a lot more right-wing, a lot more insular, a lot more, I guess, religiously or isolationist motivations. And so given that it feels like we're in this moment where our communities are moving further and further apart, but this work is still so important to us, how are you finding that struggle of being able to still do this work without it seeming like we're telling Israelis what to do or telling them that we know better? How are we advocating for positions that, quite frankly, just aren't as popular to Israelis, but for Israel? You want to start, Hadar?
Sure. Let's see, a couple pieces with that. Again, both of the organizations that came together, Americans for Peace Now and Amenu, to form New Jewish Narrative, have deep roots in Israel, deep connections to Shalom Achshav and Lior and other movements. So that's very much, the foundation of who we are and what we do. And we're also clear that we are an American organization, and our work is organizing, working, and building in both the U.S. Jewish community and more broadly in the U.S., and working with the U.S. political system. So on our day-to-day, obviously there are things we want the Israeli government to do, but our actual actions are not saying, okay, the Israeli government should do this, 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 this. It is American citizens speaking to their government, to our elected officials there. And so, to be perfectly honest, whether those views are popular in Israel or not is actually not my concern. And I don't mean to say that I don't care about it. I'm well aware of it, but just like if, when I lived in Israel, I had views that were not that popular in Israel, and that's fine, right? We're all working and fighting and advocating for what we believe to be the best answers, what we believe is going to bring peace and security and sovereignty and dignity for Israelis and Palestinians. So the Israelis don't like it argument, that's fine with me. And I will say, in terms of the question of communities drifting apart or is the community or younger elements of the community still as connected to Israel, one of the things that I find the most is this very interesting moment, certainly in the United States, and I think you've got parallels around the world, where actually many, many more people outside of just the Jewish community care about this all of a sudden and are engaged in this. And I can tell you, in the United States, this issue in terms of electoral work has always been a fringe thing, basically. There were small, even within the Jewish community, most American Jews don't identify this as a top-tier electoral issue, and certainly not other Americans. And that's not true anymore, and for horrible reasons and with a lot of terrible impact, but also actually with some opportunities in it, that as more people on the national level in the United States are engaging in this, learning, engaging with their elected officials in this, it opens opportunities for different voices to be heard and different views to be highlighted about what we think the US government should be doing in this situation.
So I agree with a lot of that, and I think what's key is, first of all, yes, it might be the case that we are advocating for things that are not that popular in Israel, but as Mickey spoke to very well in Lior, there is a whole ecosystem in Israel of people who are fighting day in, day out, and actually we're here to elevate their voices. And one of the things that's core to our strategy at Yachad is to be able to give a platform to someone like Lior, to be able to bring him to the UK, put him in front of parliamentarians, put him in front of members of the Jewish community, in front of rabbis, in front of members of youth movements, in front of people like you, and to be able to say there are alternatives in Israel. Because actually, when you're confronted with a reality that says, 70+% of the Israeli public are right-wing, would vote for right-wing parties, and you look at the Israeli government, if that is the Israel of today, then effectively what we are saying to an entire generation of people in the Jewish community is that if you want to support Israel, here it is. Support Ben Gvir, support Smotrich, support Netanyahu, and that's what's on offer. And actually, quite frankly, if that's what's on offer, they're going to reject it, and so should they. Because if you're brought up with liberal Jewish values, you cannot possibly accept that the incarnation of your Jewish values sits inside the Israeli government. And so really, I don't have that much truck with this notion of we are doing disservice to Israel or Israelis, or we're misrepresenting their views, or Israelis don't want what we want. Because actually, we as Jews in the diaspora don't want that Israeli government. And I think that one of the things that I've said many times to people recently is that this idea of Jewish unity is a false one. That we're often told that we, the Jewish people, have to stay unified for the sake of unity. And actually, one of the most powerful things that someone said to me, and it was prior to October the 7th, but I was in London at an event, a very small event, and Noah Harari was speaking, who I'm sure lots of you know his work, and he was asked about the notion of Jewish unity, and it was around the time of the judicial coup, and he said to this very small group of select Jewish leaders, "You're all obsessed with keeping your community unified and united and not stoking division. But if at the end of this process of keeping us all unified as the Jewish people, we end up unified behind a permanent fascist government in Israel, then what was the point? What is the point of Jewish unity if that's what it's for?" And so, I think actually what we're doing is really, and this sounds very arrogant, and I don't mean it like this, but the way I see the role of organizations like ours is that we're the people that are maintaining Jewish values, and the Jewish values that we want to see inside the state of Israel are the Jewish values that we want to see inside the diaspora too. And so it doesn't really concern me, if I'm really honest, I guess much like you, that there is a divergence, because I want that divergence, and the reason that we do that work is because I think that we're the people that are true to the values on which the state of Israel was founded, and I don't think that Ben Gvir, Smotrich, Bibi Netanyahu are those people. I think that the work that people like Lior do, the work that people like Mickey and Nitzan do, they are the people that are really following in the footsteps of the founders of Israel, and our role as diaspora Jews is to support them in that work.
Yeah, I think that there's something interesting in, I think Hadar, especially you touched on it, of this idea of these are also, you're speaking to American elected officials, and I mean, same with, your members of parliament, same for us, and we're going to be doing the same thing actually on Tuesday, that we'll be going to Ottawa to Parliament Hill, and we'll be bringing some of you along with us to meet with our parliamentarians, and we've done that every year with these conferences, and it's great. And you're right that those voices, if we don't bring those voices to Parliament, they are not hearing from those voices, and they, at least, depending on the government you have in Canada right now, we have a government that is hungry to hear these voices. So thank you, by the way, for coming to do that. But I'm wondering if you both kind of butt up against the same thing that I found here, which is that as much as it is about our Canadian values and our Canadian, the Canada-Israel partnership and allyship, a lot of times what I hear where we get the most pushback, and there may be folks, and this is not a criticism, there may be folks in the room who feel this way, and I'd love to have that conversation more as well, but there's very much a feeling of people will say to me, I agree, Ben Gvir and Smotrich, they're awful, they're such an embarrassment, they're an embarrassment to the Jewish people, what Netanyahu is doing is awful, but asking the Canadian government to take action against something happening in Israel, that feels like a step too far for me. And that's, I think, where we're really, that's where we're trying to move the needle. That is I think my biggest struggle right now with JSpace. How do we move that needle? Because I think also then people see, and we heard it from Mr. Oliphant in his opening remarks, right? People see it at the same time as this rise in anti-Semitism, which you're also seeing in your home countries, and they're saying, the rise of anti-Semitism is because groups like yours are asking for all these actions against Israel, and it's emboldening the anti-Semites. So, stop doing it. That would be, I guess, the counter-argument to the Yuval Noah Harari thing of no, stay unified, because, maybe the argument would be, I'd rather us be fascist and alive than fighting for liberalism, but seeing this continued rise of anti-Semitism, which is dangerous and is killing right now. So, How are you guys navigating that in your community? Do you hear that as well? And like, how have you navigated that, or what would be your advice for us to navigate that?
Sure. A couple different things in there. So starting off with the very common for what I hear all the time of like, yes, it's horrible, it's an embarrassment, but like, no, you can't say that to elected officials, you can't say that to non-Jews, basically, right, is the argument. It's like, we're only supposed to say that around the Shabbat table. Yeah. I think that's garbage, to be perfectly honest. And I understand the sentiment, right? Like, I get the sentiment, but that's not the world we live in, right? And again, to the unity question, like, I am not unified with AIPAC, for example, and nor do I wish to be. And if they would like to stop doing what they're doing and do what we're doing so we could be unified, great. But I'm not interested in doing that the other way around, right? And the argument is never that they should stop, or again, in the US, the ADL, or our federation movement, or whoever it is who's those dominant voices on the right. They never say, gee, maybe we should stop and do what you guys are doing. That's not how that plays. So I'm not interested. And we talk a lot, again, we named our organization New Jewish Narrative. And so we talk a lot about changing the narrative within our community, within our broader political space. And one of the elements of that is the permission structures, is that all of our organizations for decades and decades and decades, again, in the United States, led by AIPAC, but with almost every other Jewish organization falling in line for a long time, their job was to tell elected officials what they're not allowed to do or say about Israel. No, you can't do that. No, you can't say that. No, that's wrong. That's anti-Israel. That's anti-Semitic. You can't this, you can't that, you can't the other. And you get a lot of, to your earlier question, oh, well, you don't understand in the diaspora, right? Only Israelis, only people who've lived there, who have that military experience, or this and that. And for those, I don't know, most of you, I lived there for a long time. I was a special forces soldier in the IDF. And when I tell people, right-wing American Jews, that, then they just look at me really confused because they want to say, well, wait, that means you're supposed to be allowed to have an opinion, but I still don't like your opinion. And I'm like, well, actually, everybody gets to have an opinion regardless of where you live. And we're talking about what our community values and what our governments should do, right? And so the permission structures of having, in my case, American Jewish organizations and voices say, yes, we want to see our government put pressure on the Israeli government. Yes, we want to see our government condition aid that's being used to commit war crimes, say things like war crimes, for example, right, is incredibly important. And I think it's one of the actually most important functions that we and some of our colleagues play is certainly once you get to the federal level as an elected official, but even before that, you've got years and decades of political education coming from groups like AIPAC and ADL and others of like, what are you supposed to say? Like, oh, a Jewish person asked me a question, I stand with Israel, united and eternal, right? It's like they just, read out the script. And for us to come to them and say, no, I want you to actually look at what's in the best interest of the United States and Israel and Palestine, and what are we going to do about that? Again, in our case, the US is giving billions of dollars annually in military aid entirely, and I don't think they should be doing that. And I think that aid should be conditioned, and I think we should wean off that aid. And saying those things is something that until very, very few years ago, 4 to be exact, no one in the American Jewish organizational space ever said. And it's still a real short list of those of us who've said that. And so I think that, that's a really important element of what we do.
So to speak to your question, yes, I hear that exact phrase all the time, which is, I completely agree with you, but feels really awkward and I'm not so sure. And my experience has been that when we have written to our supporters and we've said, encourage them to take action on something, you will always get a few emails back which say, I fully support everything you're doing, but there is no way that I'm going to send that email to my MP. Don't be ridiculous. And first of all, I think there is just a reality of, I'm not sure how I would phrase it, but I don't think we can change that. I think that there is some of that is based on Jewish communal identity and historical trauma and a whole load of things, which makes Jews feel, I think, sometimes quite uncomfortable in public, and in public spaces inside the Jewish community, and as the Jewish community advocating publicly outside. And so I think that we're not going to take everybody with us, and I also think that's okay. This work is not easy, and it doesn't make you that popular, as I'm sure you've both also experienced. And I think that we just have to accept that there will always be a proportion of people who support largely what we're all doing, but just feel that it's just too difficult to publicly advocate, to ask an elected official to take action against a Jewish state, even though they might agree with that action and hate what the Jewish state is doing in their name. But it's just too far. And so, having said all of that, nobody ever says, and I guess this is what Hadar is saying, nobody ever turns around and says, while you were all busy deciding whether it was the right thing to do, they were all just getting on with their jobs. So while we were all anxiety-ridden about should we or shouldn't we get the UK government to encourage the UK government to sanction Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, which we spent a lot of time doing, what are the ramifications of us calling for recognition of Palestine? Should we do it? Shouldn't we do it? Are we going to lose supporters? Everybody else was busy advocating in the opposite direction without a second thought. And I think that one of the reasons that we find ourselves here where we are today is that for years and years and years, diaspora Jewish communities have effectively given Israel a blank check to say and do whatever it likes, with the expectation that we will, as diaspora Jews, not only put up and shut up, but walk into government and explain why they've done it and say that we support it. And suddenly that's becoming a really difficult thing for diaspora Jewry to do. And what I'm finding, and I don't know if this is the case in Canada, but increasingly very mainstream organizations are finding it really difficult now, because suddenly there's a whole load of things going on where they can't really put up and shut up because it's just too embarrassing. And I actually I screenshotted something that was in one of our Jewish papers the other day, so if I can find it. The Jewish press in the UK is, we have one extremely right-wing paper called the Jewish Chronicle, and then we have another paper which tries to be more pluralistic, called the Jewish News. And inside the Jewish News, they had it was called the Voice of the Jewish News. I won't read you the whole thing. I'll just read you the opening paragraph in the middle one, which says, when Israel went to war with Iran in February, British Jews did what they almost always do. They stood together. It then goes on to say, let us be clear, Israel does not cause anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism causes anti-Semitism. Hatred of Jews is hatred of Jews. But that does not mean we cannot ask harder questions about political choices made in our name. Israel's current leadership has treated diaspora support as an entitlement, not a relationship, expecting unconditional backing, regardless of how its coalition partners inflame opinion across the world. Real solidarity must include the freedom to say when Israel's leaders are making life harder for Jews everywhere. And to me, this was a really interesting development, which was a mainstream Jewish publication saying, well, it's a bit embarrassing and awkward for us to say that Israel bears some responsibility for the fact that British Jews are having a bad time, but actually it does, and we don't really like it, and now we kind of want to say that in public, which is kind of what we've been saying for the last decade and a half, and now they've caught up. And so I actually think that the direction we're headed in is where most sensible Jews are going to go and end up, because otherwise we're going to find ourselves backed against the wall, supporting unchecked fascism, basically. And I think the best example of that we have is the death penalty bill, which, who in their right mind, even 3 years ago, could have possibly imagined a scenario in which a country in which all of our governments refer to as the only democracy in the Middle East and our greatest ally in the Middle East is passing legislation in which one group of people, based on their ethnicity, are entitled to be killed by the state. And in any other scenario, that would be completely unacceptable. Now, the silence inside the British Jewish community over that, and from mainstream Jewish leadership, is shocking, but that silence will come back to bite us, because actually we will no longer be able to say, oh yes, look at our great democratic ally, because that's not what democracies do. And so, I think the situation we're in today, where people say to you or me, I just don't feel very comfortable doing that, fine, you don't have to feel comfortable doing it, but if we don't do it and nothing gets said and nothing gets done, we're going to have the death penalty bill in many other incarnations, and when my kids turn around to me and say, oh, well, when you were a kid and, and you had this relationship to the state of Israel, what was that like? What am I going to say? Well, we were too embarrassed and too uncomfortable to say we didn't like what Israel was doing, so we let it carry on. And now, unfortunately, you can't have a relationship to the state of Israel because it's a country that has endless bills like the death penalty bill, because that's the direction that we're headed in.
I want to just add on that a tiny little tidbit, which was whenever the change government was a few years ago, when Bennett was the prime minister and Lapid for that 10 minutes, they sent Mikey Herzog, the brother of the president, to Washington, D.C. as the ambassador to the U.S. And I went and I had a meeting with him, sat, and we're talking about things, and he said to me, he's a very nice man, he said to me, I know we don't agree on everything, but you guys are part of our coalition. I think of you like Meretz. And I was like, okay, great. So, we're partners in this. And I was like, all right, that's a perfectly reasonable thing to say. And he said, but, there's one thing when I was looking at what a lot of the other organizations do here in Washington and what you guys do, you guys really don't always do a good enough job of defending Israel in Congress. And I looked at him and I was like, well, that's weird, because that's not my job at all. I was like, it is absolutely not my job to defend Israel in Congress. And he was just dumbfounded. He was like, of course it is. And I said, no, it's our job to advocate for what we think is the best policy and what we think the United States government should do. That's our job. And he just looked at me and he was like, and because right around that same time, both the American Jewish Committee and the ADL, two of the biggest American Jewish organizations, had things leak, where this was around the judicial coup, where they had internal documents that were leaked, where they had conversations that said, look, we don't like this, we think this is a really bad idea, it's anti-democratic, it's not good for Israel, but we're gonna go up into Congress and defend it because that's our job. So it was understandable that he was surprised, but I think, again, it's such an important function of what all of us do is to actually stand up for those values and those beliefs that we and the majority of our communities hold.
Can I just add one thing, sorry, which is that the other thing which I find quite amusing is that the expectation of diaspora Jews is that we pay deference to the state of Israel, and that and also, that we are maybe lesser beings because we live in the diaspora and we don't live inside Israel. Well, that level of respect that we as diaspora Jews are expected to pay to Israel is not returned to diaspora Jewry one little bit. And so the fact that...
Except by Amichai Shikli.
Yes, no, well, that's my point. The fact that the Minister for Diaspora Affairs is a man who doesn't believe that most diaspora Jews, of whom most of are Reform Jews in America, are real Jews, says all you need to know about how much Israel cares about us, or that they send their ambassadors out to defend Israel into Jewish communities. I mean, the ambassador, she's now, sadly returned to Israel, but the ambassador we had in the UK, Zippy Ottavelli, also didn't believe that Reform Jews were real Jews, and hosted extremist organizations in the Knesset as many times as she could kind of host an organization. And she was sent to to the UK, to London, to be basically a representative of British Jewry, which is how she behaved. And actually, all that was a reflection of how much the Netanyahu regime couldn't care less about British Jews, because she was absolutely terrible for British Jews. And so actually, I think it's perfectly fine for us to turn around and say, well, we've also got an opinion, and we're going to be very loud and clear about what our opinion is, because there is no respect giving back to diaspora Jewry, and this idea that we are, one people is quite frankly nonsense when you look at how the Israeli government behaves towards us.
Yeah. Really interesting points. And actually, the thing that I actually found the most interesting in all of that was something that you brought up much earlier on, but when you were reading that piece from the newspaper and you said there's these two different types of Jewish newspapers, it just got me thinking I think that one of the things that I would add, or that I would want to kind of look to all of us to mobilize around and work on, is that a lot of times why we see, a lot of people say when we talk about these divisions or changes that now organizations can call for an end of US aid to Israel, for example, there's oftentimes I think this idea that that just kind of happens, and there's shifts in the world, and things happen, and people pick up new opinions or change their opinions. And like that's obviously true a little bit. We're obviously guided by, you know, the zeitgeist in the world around us. But it also so much has to do with the infrastructure that exists on the ground. The infrastructure that exists, I mean, in the U.S., it's much larger. Obviously, the largest Jewish community. It makes a lot of sense. But, you know, organizations like yours, like J Street, also Jewish media, the fact that these opinions can be heard and written about and debated and discussed in Jewish media sources that Jews are reading and then discussing with their families and their friends. It creates that kind of like, you know, I think you were talking about this earlier, like it creates this permission structure to be like, yeah, we can say these things. And even, you know, you're kind of identifying, okay, these two different newspapers, and I'm just sitting here going, wait a second, you have two Jewish newspapers?
I have to tell you that
The
one
right-wing
is
one and the
permanently-
very
yeah,
right-wing one.
exactly.
Okay,
And
look,
one of them is
there's still
permanently
two.
running out of money, so...
But you know, I think that like, yeah, and for, I don't know how much you guys know or how much our Israeli guests know, but in Canada, this infrastructure it's tiny. And our Jewish community is actually around, I think, the same size as yours, maybe even a little bit bigger. We have 350,000 Jews.
So we're about 250,
250,000.
260.
Okay. So we've got a larger Jewish community in Canada, and yet when we look at what you guys have built, and you know, we're kind of similar in like parliamentary system. We're not the U.S. Oh, this is so fun. We get to exclude the U.S.
It's okay, we deserve it.
There just has been more of this being built, and I think you know, I don't know that I necessarily have a question here, but I think that it's really interesting for our group here to kind of look at these folks and to be able to say like, yes, once this didn't exist, and then folks like you and you came along and built it and fostered it and nurtured it and created it into something that we now see actually having, you know, having a real impact, having an impact on the permission structure of the Jewish community, how your governments react to these things, and I think there's a way, there's a space that you've all created that allows you to do it with nuance from a place of a love of Israel, and I think that I would just, you know, I think that you guys are such great examples of how. And I guess here's my question, or here's where I'd like to hear how you do this, or where this comes from, but this idea that we'll get lumped in with the extremists on either side, I think you've disproved that. I think that you've said, hey, look, we're going to be strong enough to show that there's actually a third way to do this, and we see that gaining traction. And so I guess I'd like to hear a little bit about, you know, in a time of such polarization and extremes, how you are able to build that infrastructure in a place of nuance and understanding and empathy.
First of all, obviously it's not easy, and especially in a world of kind of clickbait social media, you know, saying, you know, it's a bit complicated, guys, doesn't really fit very well in an Instagram post or a tweet. It's, you know, it is hard to be nuanced, but one of the things that I really noticed in the kind of 2 years post October the 7th was, I remember I did a lot of media interviews when they were kind of, you know, the media was constantly looking for talking heads, constantly, all the time, non-stop, for months and months and months. And I went into a BBC News studio with a Palestinian partner of ours, actually, who happened to be in London at the time. And the news presenter was basically, and this is not an exaggeration, she was like, you know, it wasn't rolling. You know, we were kind of talking before it was live, and they were showing something else. And she was basically slumped over the news desk, and she said to me and Hamza, I'm so happy you're here. Should I just spend my life either getting an extremist from one side or an extremist from another side? And it's just such hard work, because I know that I've got an extremist, and then I have to question them really hard. And actually, it's really nice to have two people here who are moderates, they're not extremists, who can have a conversation, because it's just so refreshing. And actually, I think that there is actually a desire for nuance. I think that most people are not extremists. And if you look, there's some really interesting polling in the UK. There's an organisation called More in Common, and they basically are looking for kind of what you'd expect, which is common kind of themes amongst the British population. So this idea that we are kind of all polarised and extreme on either side of the spectrum, what their polling shows is that actually that's not really true. And unsurprisingly, the people who are very loud at either ends are extremely noisy, and that the vast majority of people sit somewhere in the middle with quite complicated opinions, or opinions which are, I just don't really understand what's going on. And they've done tons of polling on the Israel-Palestine conflict. And what they have largely found is that the overwhelming majority of people sit on a spectrum of, I have empathy for both sides, I don't really understand what's happening, or I have slightly more empathy for one side than another. But in the main, I think this is a terrible situation for everybody. And so I do think that nuance has currency, basically. It's much harder, and it's much less sexy. And I often have to say to the Yachad team, well, we'll sit in a team meeting, and they'll look at something, an organisation that is not dissimilar to us, but more to the left of us in the UK will have done, that will have, and they'll have put it on Instagram, and they'll have 50,000 likes on this picture. And I have to remind the team, because I can see they're all getting slightly wound up by it, that 50,000 likes on Instagram doesn't translate into anything concrete, doesn't mean anything. And actually, sometimes the hard work is in the behind-the-scenes lobbying efforts and the advocacy you do and the very quiet conversations you have with people, and that's what really bears fruit. And so, it's harder, and it's not as exciting, and it's boring sometimes, quite frankly. But that's, if we're in the business of systemic change isn't all sexy Instagram posts, basically. Unfortunately, it would be really nice if it was, but it's not. And so I think we just have to, basically, it's hard grafting, and, that's not exciting, but it requires people like you and people like you in the room to support it, basically. But it's really, really important. And the other thing I would just add, just in a very Jewish context, and I saw some blue shirts and white strings over there, but young people, I think, the future of the Jewish community, I think, is really like a very compelling narrative. And one of the things that we, right from the early days of Yachad, kind of recognized and did was to say, it will be your fault, you, the kind of legacy establishment, if you exclude us from the conversation, because we have the next generation with us. And you were all very worried about what's happening to the next generation. Are they going to have a relationship with Israel? Are they going to be Jewish? And so at your peril, exclude us from the conversation, because they're in our camp. And actually that has been really, really important for us, because it's true. And so what that has done is basically given us the first line of defense. And what it means is that sometimes when we want to do something which is a bit too controversial, a bit difficult, the first group of people we go to is all of the young people we work with in youth movements and on university campus. And we say to them, please, can you do it first? We'll help you do it. We won't put our name as Yachad anywhere near it, but we will do all the work for you, and you just have to front it. And that basically means that the establishment Jewish community, they can be annoyed, but if they go after you, then they're going after an entire segment of the Jewish community who they claim to be really worried about. And I think strategically, it has opened up an awful lot of space for us, because we basically send them into battle on our behalf. And I think it really works, and I think it's been really effective, and it is the reason that when we were a new and fledgling organisation and we had just about enough money to employ a second member of staff, the second member of staff we employed was our youth worker. And in any conversation we've ever had about growing the staff team, reducing the staff team, the one position that never has ever gone up for discussion has been our youth worker, for that exact reason.
Super interesting.
That's very interesting. All right, couple thoughts on this. So starting with sort of the concept of nuance, I will say I actually sometimes push back on that, because we have the same conversation, right? There's people, everyone's far left, everyone's far right, and Hannah, what you said is absolutely true. Like, being in the middle and more nuanced is more difficult. One of the things that I drive our team crazy with is I never want, we don't always succeed, but I never want us to sound like we're speaking in organizational voice. I just want to say the thing, because I actually don't think it's always more complicated. Sometimes it is. But sometimes it's actually just not what, AIPAC is saying on this side, or the anti-Zionists are saying on this side. And we're not inventing anything new, right? Like I said before, we're representing the same views as, the Meretz folks, the Labor folks, now Democratim, whatever. We're not making this up. And we're adapting it as the world changes. And one of the things that's actually, I think, really important is a lot of the legacy organizations aren't adapting as the world changes. So they're saying, no, here's our policy. We've held this exact same position since 1984, immutably, and turns out, the world's not the same. And so that doesn't work that well. But just saying the things straightforward and disputing the fact that what we're saying is somehow this strange, difficult, nuanced, we have to thread the needle. Like, no, we're just saying the thing that most of the people actually agree with, not the crazy extremists on either side. So that's one piece. I want to talk for a second about the infrastructure question you were asking at the beginning, because I have been lucky enough, I guess, a couple of times to be early at the table as I've watched the American Jewish infrastructure change. So I'll start with now. We are members of the Conference of Presidents of American Jewish Organizations, which is really horrible. If in case you're not familiar with it, it is a collection of all of those legacy organizations. There are a few other groups, our denominational bodies, and a few others in it who I think are reasonable and good folks trying to do good things, but also a lot of extremely terrible groups. And we're in it because both Americans for Peace Now and Amenu were in it decades ago, and so we are sort of have that legacy seat. But I've been part of a few efforts going back probably 20 years was maybe the first meeting of what is now the Jewish Social Justice Roundtable in the United States, which was actually founded by a bunch of quite mainstream groups for the most part, but who wanted there to be a place for organizations to come together and also talk about things that weren't just Israel and Palestine, which within the coalition structure space of the American Jewish community basically didn't exist. And that's now a very large and vibrant organization with many, many members and do lots of different things. And so we see it both by changing topic in some places, but also, I was not there day one at the founding of J Street, but I worked at J Street, I think I started the 7th month or whatever it was at the beginning of it, and was there for a few years and helped it go from very small to quite big, and watched how that changed our work and our organizing and our voice in the American Jewish community. So those structural questions, I think, are incredibly important, because without, when I moved from Israel to the United States, those things didn't exist, and those verses weren't there. And I remember I was working for an organization, and I got sent to a synagogue to go talk, and I was talking to people, and somebody got up and yelled at me for saying Palestine, right? Because there is no Palestine. There's no such thing. And this guy decided that he needed to tell me how wrong I was on that. And then, related to what I was saying earlier, I was talking about Lebanon and what was going on. This was the late 1990s. And he said to me, I've been on 17 Federation trips up to the border there. I've seen it. I've stood there, and I've heard from the IDF spokespeople what's happening, and, blah, 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 and you don't know what you're talking about. And again, I said to him, I was like, when was the last time you were there? And it was, December of 1995 or whatever it was. And I was like, oh, cool. I was 4 miles on the other side of that border then. And again, just the blank stares, right? How can this be? And that's because there weren't structures, there weren't organizations that were actually talking about what was really happening on the ground. And what you get when that happens, and this is still unfortunately true for large segments of both the American Jewish community and our political leadership, is you get fantasy Israel. Right? You were talking before, the only democracy in the Middle East, the light unto the nations, all this. You get people who, even if they actually know better, that's their voice about it. That's what they do, and that's what they say. And we now have, very unfortunately, we also have the only doom and gloom people who all they will look at or talk about or think about is Gaza and occupation, and all you're going to hear is genocide and apartheid and these other things, which again are all very real and need to be addressed. But if that's the entirety of the conversation, you're still missing something. And so what we talk about, and I've seen some of this language here, right, is working for the aspirational Israel that we support, not pretending that that's what it is, not pretending that everything is awesome there and there isn't a hideous racist death penalty bill, but working and doing everything we can in our communities to get to that community and that vision that we support.
Amazing. Yeah. Okay, I'm inspired. Our community is going to be your communities when we're big.
Also, I'd be happy to donate a lot of our Jewish press to you because I don't want to.
I thought you were going to say donate a lot of money, and I was like, I just write the check right now. I know, in the Jewish nonprofit space, we are making the big bucks, so we should, okay, excellent. So that's that brings us to the end of our time here. That was wonderful. Thank you both so much. Yeah, round of applause. Wonderful, wonderful.